We're going to start off with a game today because, I just think it'll be fun. So on the screen are going to be a number of different items, and you have to guess, are these items real? Which of the items on the screen is real, and which are made of cake? Let's put the first one up there. Well, that one's obvious. Looks pretty close, but definitely the one on that side is cake. But which of these, number 1, 2, 3, or 4, is real, and which is cake? 3? 1, 2, 4. All right, we covered the whole gamut. Let's see which one is real. All of them are real except for number 3. Wow, they did a great job on that one, didn't they? All right, let's take a look at the next one. We have some oranges on the screen. Which of those are real and which are cake? There's no numbers on them, so you're going to have to... The orange one? You have to guess, kind of get it in your mind since there's not numbers. But let's look at it and see. Oh, there. They all look so real, but one of them is not. It's funny that we did this and Amy brought a watermelon up here. It kind of goes together, doesn't it? All right, let's look at the next one. We have a pair of shoes. How in the world could you make shoes into cake? Which one of those is real? Is it the right shoe or the left shoe? A right shoe, they say. The one closest to us. All right, let's see. All right, if you said the right shoe, the one closest to us, you were correct. But I'll be honest, they both look pretty darn real to me. So, good job. Give yourselves a hand. Your prize is you get a sermon. A sermon, but I think that the game goes along with the sermon because Revelation that we're studying is a divine vision that tries to help us see that everything in the world is not as it seems. Sometimes you think it's real, but it's cake. Sometimes you think it's cake, but it's real. But sometimes the things that we see around us are not always what they seem. You can't always believe everything you hear, see, or what people tell you. You have to understand there's more going on. Even if it just simply comes to, for instance, in the news, there's always going to be some kind of a bias that is there in the news. Bias on one side, bias on the other side. If anybody ever says they are completely unbiased in what they're telling you, they just don't understand what their bias is. Everybody has a point of view that kind of infiltrates, and you can try to be as objective as you can, but everything has some kind of a bias to it. And oftentimes, in the world that we live in, we have to understand, Jesus told us, or the Bible tells us, that there is more going on than just what you see. That we don't fight against just flesh and blood, but we fight against, there is spiritual warfare that is going on. Spiritual forces of darkness and the spiritual forces of God are battling beyond what we can see. And all of this is happening, and it affects what we experience in life. And Revelation comes into that, and it is a vision where Jesus tries to show the churches and to show us that there is something going on beyond what we can see. And sometimes what we see is not what is really going on, what is happening. Revelation was given to the Apostle John in the late 1st century, around 95, 96 AD. It was given to encourage Christians who were suffering great persecution under the Roman Emperor Domitian. They were suffering persecution, and God is trying to tell them what is happening and what you see happening. There's more going on than just what's on the surface. So take hope, because God is doing something great. God is doing something big. God is doing something with eternal consequences to it. So what you're experiencing, there's a reason, and there's more to it than meets the eye. Revelation chapter 1, verse 19 says the vision is about things that are happening now and things that will happen. So that's telling us that some of the things in Revelation were actually current events. Sometimes we read them and we think, because in our modern context, we often think of Revelation as being a book about the end times. And it does speak about certain things that happen in the end times. But the danger is that when we read Revelation, we think everything that it's talking about is about things that are going to happen at the end. But it tells us right there that it is a vision about things that are happening now. When is now? 95, 96 AD, the first century. These were things that the people were experiencing, many of them. But it also says this, things that are happening now and things that will happen, which means that it does speak about future things. But remember, when it says future, that means anything past 95 or 96 AD. So it could be within the next year or the next 5 years. So many of the future things even that Revelation talks about are things that already happened when we're looking at it from our perspective, looking back 2,000 years. However, there are also things in Revelation that speak about things that will happen at the end, or things that are still yet to happen. Again, the danger is for us in our context, because it is human nature. We always want to make everything about us. And so when we read Revelation, we immediately start thinking about, well, what is it talking about? Is it talking about what's happening right now for us? And many Christian leaders, teachers, preachers like to take Revelation because it is a very symbolic book, very cryptic, and they start trying to figure out, I'm going to crack the code to Revelation and explain how what it said 2,000 years ago is about what's happening right now in my city, in my country. It may be, but more often than not, it's more broad than that. We have to be very careful that we don't try to take what Jesus said and think that it was only about us right here in Dalton, Georgia, when it is about the whole span of what God is doing. All right. Revelation, things that are happening now, things that will happen in the future. And the part that we are reading about the 7 churches is dealing with the 7 first-century churches in Turkey. So let's look at Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Write this letter to the angel of the church in Smyrna. Now again, I just want to pause and remind you, angel represents the pastor or the preacher or the leaders of the church in Smyrna. We learned that is the angel word is a symbol that meant the leaders of the church. Write this letter to the angel of the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, who was dead but is now alive. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they are not, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days. But if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he is saying to the churches. However, whoever is victorious will not be harmed by the second death. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The people of Smyrna were suffering. The Christians in Smyrna were suffering. They needed hope so that they could endure. And Jesus reminds us, he starts to offer them hope by reminding them who he is. This is what he says. He says, This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, the one who was dead but now alive. And so he's reminding them in a subtle way, Jesus is the first and the last. They are suffering. It is real suffering. But he wants them to think of this in the context of eternity. What they are suffering is happening right now. But this is within the context of eternity. Jesus also suffered. Remember, it was an awful suffering that he had to go through in the Passion, being tortured, being betrayed, being crucified. Awful torture. It was the worst form of torture and pain you could inflict upon the human body, to be nailed to a wooden cross until you die. Jesus experienced that suffering. And yet Jesus was the first and the last. In other words, Jesus existed before time, and he will always exist. That's a mind-blowing expanse of time to think of. And yet in this one moment, he experienced suffering. That doesn't take away the fact that he suffered, but it puts it in a broader scheme, a broader scale. These people in Smyrna were suffering, but Jesus is saying this is upon a grand scale that you can't even comprehend. And there's going to be a time 10 billion years from now, after you've been in glory, in eternity for 10 billions of 10 billions of 10 billions of years, this moment of suffering is going to be forgotten. It's not going to seem as bad. Jesus also says he is the one who was dead, but now is alive. And this is another reminder. Jesus went through suffering. He even died. And yet he is now alive. And this is an important thing to remind the people in Smyrna, because some of them may die in the suffering. But they are going, if they follow Jesus, just as he is alive, they also are going to be alive again. He says, I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. Again, this is a part of how Revelation turns everything upside down. Because when they looked at their situation, the church in Smyrna was suffering. They were being persecuted. And they were poor. Their poverty wasn't their fault. It's not like they made a bad decision and invested in the wrong stock, or the economy went south and they lost all their money. They were poor because of persecution. They were they were people that they used to consider, formerly in their life, consider friends, who were now turning on them, persecuting them as Christians, and taking their property, stealing from them, and making it their own. So here's the situation in Smyrna. In the first century, there was not such a great distinction between Jewish people and Christian people as there is today. In the first century, most Christians were Jewish people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And so Jewish people and Christian people were in the same community, and they worshiped together and they worked together. They did business with one another. But it began to be that many of the Jewish people began to resent Christian people and and thought that they were heretics because they believed in Jesus Christ. And it wasn't just a theological dispute. They actually thought that, well, we can turn them into the Roman authorities and say that they are not legitimate Jewish people, but they're heretics, that they're atheists, that they don't believe in the Roman gods, and that they're doing all kinds of bad things. And they would turn them in, and the Roman government would take their property, take their businesses, take their money, and oftentimes would give it to their Jewish neighbors. This was a great betrayal that was happening. So the Christians in Smyrna weren't poor because they'd made bad decisions. They were poor because they were persecuted. People that they formerly thought of as friends and neighbors were persecuting them. And yet Jesus says, you are suffering and you have poverty, but actually you're rich. He turns it upside down. How can this be? How is it that they are rich when they have no money and their homes have been taken from them? Nobody will do business with them anymore because they are those Christians. It's because, remember what Jesus said? He said, don't store up treasures on earth where rust corrupts it and moths eat it and where thieves break in and steal it. Don't store up treasures on earth. Store up treasures in heaven where neither rust nor moth nor thieves can destroy it. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so what Jesus is saying here is that because they have suffered for the sake of God's kingdom and for Jesus Christ, they have made their bank accounts on earth may be empty, but their bank accounts in heaven are busting at the seams because their suffering on earth is creating great deposits in heaven. And so a lot of people would say, well, so what? They're still suffering on earth. But the idea within the Christian faith is we need to be focused on eternity and not on just what's happening right now. Because Jesus is the beginning and the end. And eternity spans from before time began till after time ends. It goes on forever. And the suffering that we experience in this life, or the wealth that we experience in this life, or the poverty, it lasts but an instant, and then it is gone. But what remains for us in eternity is forever, and it is protected by the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. There are Christians in our world who are poor now, who we look at and feel pity for. But in eternity, they will be the richest people we know, and that will last forever. There are many Christians who are wealthy now, who seem so wealthy now, who will be impoverished for eternity because they focused on what happened in this little tiny span of time we call life and didn't focus on eternity. We need to be sure that we are investing in our heavenly wealth and being less focused. And I want to point out that the poverty that Jesus is talking about here is not poverty that comes from making poor financial decisions, right? Because we spent our money on things and didn't manage it well in this life. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about people who are poor because they've suffered persecution. Or it could also be they are not as wealthy as they would have been because they gave up their wealth for the sake of God's kingdom, either by living a life of integrity or by abstaining from something, refusing to get ahead by breaking the rules and cheating, or by taking advantage of others. Verse 9b says, I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they are not, because they belong to Satan. Remember, here again, Jesus is saying, what you see is not all that there is. There were many people living alongside these Christians who said that they were God's people. We are God's people because we follow the Bible. We go to synagogue every Sunday. We worship God. And yet their actions actually opposed Jesus Christ. They are not God's people. They are actually Satan's people. because they are opposing what Jesus is trying to do, trying to save us, trying to turn us back to God. There are many people in the world who claim to be religious and outwardly looked religious, but they were not. Today, in our world, just because someone goes to church or says that they are a Christian doesn't mean that they are a true follower of Christ. Remember, everything is not necessarily as it appears. We have to ask the question, do we really follow Jesus? Do these people who claim to be religious follow Jesus, truly follow Jesus, live the way He calls us to live, sacrifice the way He calls us to sacrifice? Because it could be that they are claiming to be a follower of Christ, but they oppose Christ and His kingdom by their actions. Jesus also said, don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. How is that? Why would you not be afraid of what you suffer? What Jesus said to them applies to us too. We need not be afraid of suffering, and here's why. Number one, Jesus has already overcome suffering and death. Remember who Jesus is. He is the one who was dead, but now lives forever. We will live forever too if we follow Him, if we are faithful to Him, in a kingdom where there is no more suffering and no more death. So we don't need to fear suffering because Jesus has already overcome it. And number two, we don't need to fear suffering because Jesus is with us during our suffering. We don't go through it alone. Remember, Jesus is the one who walks among the lampstands. In other words, in Revelation 2:1, it says that. In other words, He is walking among us. He is with us as we suffer. And He holds the leaders of the church in His right hand. He cares about us. He is with us. He will never leave us or forsake us. And actually, contrary to what we usually think, suffering is a benefit to us. It is a chance for us to draw closer to Christ. It is a chance for us to deposit wealth in our eternal bank account. It is a chance for us to experience Christ walking with us in a very real and intimate way. A third reason that we don't need to be afraid when we suffer is because eternal glory awaits the faithful. Jesus said in Revelation 2:10, "Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life." Recently I was sick. I had to go to a clinic up here in Varnell. It seemed like it was just a cold, but it wasn't going away, and I felt terrible, had no energy, sore throat. And I called Big Mama one day and I said, "I'm not going to come into the office today. I'm going to see the doctor." And I got there and they, did the evaluation on me and said, "All right, we know what's wrong with you. We've got some medicine that will help make you better. Now, we can either give you some pills and it'll take a couple of days, or we can give you a shot and it'll go to work right away. Which one do you want?" And I thought, give me the shot. And some people will say, "Well, why would you do that? I'd rather take the pills." Well, one thing, I don't really like taking pills. They're annoying. You have to remember to take them. But a shot hurts. A shot hurts. And it's that needle, and a lot of people are really scared of those needles, and I don't like them either. And yeah, it does hurt when they stick it in your arm. But my thinking is, that pain, it lasts for a few seconds. And then the medicine goes to work right away, and I start to feel better. I can take a little pain for a few seconds. Now that seems like a silly example, but when you look at suffering in the scheme of eternity, I don't want to belittle the suffering that we face by any means. But when you put it in the scheme of eternity, then our suffering becomes so small. And it's here for a moment and then gone. Suffering is temporary, but our reward from suffering, because of suffering, is eternal. Jesus promises a crown of life, eternal victory, honor, joy for those who endure suffering and remain faithful. And when our faithfulness leads to more suffering, it means that we will have even more rewards in heaven. There is always going to be more going on in our lives and in our world than what meets the eye. God is working behind the scenes, and we must learn to trust Him, to look with spiritual eyes, to listen with spiritual ears, and sometimes just to trust Him because we don't have a mind that is capable of understanding everything that's going on. But we believe that God is in control, even when it doesn't seem like it. And these are words that were written to people who were being tortured to death in the first century. And I think they can speak to us today, even though we don't face suffering quite like that. But we sometimes see things happen in our world, terrible things, that make us question, why? The kingdom of heaven is eternal, and it is breaking into our world. And even when we see things happening that we don't understand or we don't like, we know that God is in control, and Jesus is with us. As we close together, I want to share a responsive reading together to remind us to listen and hear what the Spirit says to us. Would you stand? And the words will be on the screen as we read together. The Spirit of Christ walks among us and speaks to our hearts. Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand. Even when I feel alone, I am never forsaken.
Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand.
Even when the world seems dark, God's light is still shining.
Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand.
Even when I don't see the way forward, God is already making one.
Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand.
Even when I am weak, His power is made perfect.
Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand.
Even when I see only loss, God is working for redemption.
Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand.
Even when I feel unworthy, I am called and dearly loved.
Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand.
There's more going on than meets the eye. We must look with spiritual eyes and listen with spiritual ears, not just physical ones. Behind the scenes, God is doing more than we realize. Let anyone with ears to hear listen to the Spirit and understand.